Welcome to Talking Stack, Martech Advisor's weekly news podcast. Join us as Martech experts David Robb, Anand Talker, Amit Varshney, and editor Chitra Iyer talk about the things that matter this week in Martech.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Talking Stack podcast, week of 15th to 18th October. And today I am delighted to welcome Andy Frawley, who is the CEO of V12. That's a leading provider of marketing, data, and technology solutions. Andy himself is a multiple-time successful CEO and entrepreneur in the data and marketing technology space with over 30 years of experience. So welcome to the show, Andy.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Right. In today's episode, we're going to kick things off by talking about the new Radius or the latest Radius announcement, which is about their partnership with Dun & Bradstreet. This basically assumes that Dun & Bradstreet will own the data, third-party data, and Radius can own the data management and integration of this third-party data for their CDP customers. It's an interesting new approach to CDPs, and we're going to talk a little bit more about how and why it might make sense for a marketer to use this approach. And then a little later, we're going to talk about Twilio acquiring SendGrid and what that means to the whole point solution versus all-in-one suite argument we've been having since the last episode of the Talking Stack. So let's get started. Andy, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you think the CMO's approach to first-party data versus third-party data has evolved over the last few years.
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting aspects of this next new generation of CDP platforms is that you can actually manage first-party data and third-party data together. Historically, through other, RTech architectures, they've been sort of often managed separately, but at V12, we deliver a CDP with first-party data and consumer third-party data that's, based on a lookalike model so that you can actually immediately start campaigns that, start with consideration or awareness and run all the way through deep loyalty. So it's hard to do that if you've got multiple platforms managing the data. So the flexibility of these new CD platforms really enables that in a way that hasn't been possible up until now.
To continue that thought, I think, technically there's really not that much difference in the technology required to handle first-party versus third-party data. You have the same matching issues. You have some of the same quality issues, although at least in theory the third-party data should be pretty clean when it gets to you. So it's a pretty natural extension of the first-party data that's sort of the core of the CDP. And as marketers become simply more used to having their CDP in place as the place they go look for everything, it makes a lot of sense to just pull that third-party data into there. So again, it is that single unified place.
Does that also change the discussion on how much data should you have? Where should you focus on cleansing that data, right? Because I think a lot of people want to have they sort of have this hoarder mentality of, I just want all the data everywhere, just going to throw it in one place, and then we'll figure it out later. And that doesn't, I'm curious your thoughts on, how does
no,
that,
it absolutely
is that a positive or negative thing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because you can't, even with the power of these new platforms, you can't have all the data.
Right.
It's too much. We do a lot of work with, location data, mobility data, and that's 6 or 7 terabytes a day of data that's flowing through. So, people have to have the ability to sort of prioritize what data they want, at what level of granularity they want it. Otherwise, the CDP will just become another, data swamp.
So, this relationship between CDPs and DMPs, David, for example, you've spent several of the last few years talking about explaining the difference between CDPs and DMPs to potential market users and marketers. Now, the landscape has obviously evolved since then. So what are vendors from both camps saying today? How have they evolved, and what are they saying today that they were not saying, for example, a year or two ago?
Well, there is a little less confusion about the difference between the two. It's taken, frankly, about 2 years of very intensive effort from everyone in the industry, myself included, to get some understanding of that. Yeah, and you're welcome. And it's actually somewhat ironic it was even issued because, of course, DMPs are very specifically designed to support advertising. There was really a very specific use case, narrow use case for them. So it's a little odd that people got confused, but they were handling customer data and they were sort of positioned by the vendors as the solution that sort of expanded a little bit of scope creep on the vendors' side, as vendors tend to do. And then when the CDP came in with, I think, a much more legitimate claim to being sort of the place you store all your data. Hopefully, it's not a swamp, but it could be a little messy at times. Then there was a little bit of conflict and confusion. So now what we see is a relatively happy resolution to this, that people recognize there's a role for both. People actually talk about synchronizing the two, sharing data back and forth bidirectionally, so that each does its proper role, and all's right in the world, that quarter of the world.
Yeah, the bold statement. Yeah, I think I'd echo David's point a little bit, that whether it's a DMP or some other, purpose-built channel data store, we really spent the last, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 8 years where each one of these digital channels had its own, mechanism to store, manage data, to segment data, to measure and report data, and those still are out there to a large degree, whether it's a DMP or a email, ESP, email service provider. But I think what both the CDP platforms and then sort of, these sort of integration as a service concepts allow at least the data to be flowing back and forth, bidirectionally, seamlessly, with a lot of sort of data integrity. Again, that doesn't necessarily solve every problem, but it does start to, reduce the number of places that you're storing, storing data, in different places, where, one customer's activity is, sitting in 4 or 5 different databases. So I think it brings together the sort of traditional first-party data of who the customers are and, what they buy, with this sort of history of, how their interactions are, how they're interacting with a brand, how they're interacting with the brand's different channels and things like that. So I think it's a big foundational step forward. Again, how you use it, and how you take action out of it, I think, is one of the interesting things I'm watching. Is, some of the CDPs seem to have a lot of sort of actionability built in terms of actually being able to drive campaigns, and others are really just data stores. And I don't know. I mean, it'll be interesting to see if the market continues down that path, or if they all come together.
Are we seeing like a hybrid variety of CDP, or a bunch of hybrid varieties of CDPs? Those that, in this case, in the case of Radius's announcement, it is not just a CDP that manages your data, but even supplies you the data itself in case you don't have it. And so are we going to see a bunch of different hybrid CDPs?
Yeah, well, the way we like to think about this is that there's this core capability in the CDP, which all CDPs have, which is to build that database. And then they add on different options. Some will have a data management or, a third-party data option, like, say, a Radius, or a V12 for that matter. Others might have advanced analytics or advanced engagement features. So what makes them a CDP is that core of shared data management, and then different ones add on different things. At some point, you've added on so many things that the focus of the product is no longer a CDP. Right, so it may still have that data management piece built in, but would you call, Marketing Cloud a CDP? No, it might have a CDP component within it. It might build that database that's in fact technically a CDP database. But if the focus of the product is elsewhere, at some point you say, well, it's something else that's got a CDP inside. It's not a CDP system per se. So that's like the next message. Now that we've finally straightened out this whole DMP CDP thing, that's kind of the next message that we're trying to get the market to absorb. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, and that's a great segue into the next piece of news that we had to talk about this week, which is marketing clouds. I mean, Twilio just acquired SendGrid, and it was an expensive acquisition, $2 billion for an email marketing company, albeit a very experienced one. Okay, so now, what I wanted to talk about was, remember last week when Scott was here, we spoke quite at length about how better integration technology is probably going to help, this explosion of point solutions or best-in-class solutions that sort of go deep into one area, and then it's just so easy to plug and play because of the tech. But what company like Twilio or say Adobe Marketing Cloud or any of these marketing clouds would have you believe is no, customers actually want everything in one sort of front end, and they don't want to be plugging and playing different things. They want one person to offer everything. What's your take on Andy, how have you, let's start with you. How have you seen this landscape change? And then Anand, it would be great to hear from you as well in terms of the landscape, how that's changing. Because you weren't here last week either.
So I think, it's interesting. So I agree with the point that with a lot of these technologies and a lot of the integration technologies, the ability to integrate data is, much easier than it used to be. And it can be done, different modalities, batch and real time and all that. I think the challenge as it relates to marketing clouds and sort of where the debate lies, although I'm not sure, the reality completely supports the debate, is it's one thing to get your data together. The next frontier from a, execution standpoint is you have to get your content and rules together. So, if you have all your data together, but you still have, 4 different platforms you're doing to do audience development and 3 different platforms that manage content and personalize, dynamically generate content, you haven't really solved the problem. That's the promise of the marketing clouds. I actually don't think many of the marketing clouds actually deliver on that promise, but that's what sort of the demo would tell you is it's all one, you can go in one platform and offer a set of rules about how you want to design a customer journey and it magically happens. I think in most cases there's still a lot of sort of fracture under the surface of that, but that is, the promise. And it's the hard thing about a multi-vendor strategy is, again, data integration is one thing, sort of business rule integration is sort of a different thing and a much harder problem to solve in my mind.
Totally agree with Andy, and to add to this, and of course, you guys know me pretty well. Like, I'll always throw the business angle into this, and we'll come back to what relates to marketers. But every one of these acquisitions that seem to be just a little bit 1 degree away from what their core business is that these organizations have gotten large. I mean, Twilio is really big, right? I mean, Adobe's gotten to a certain size, bringing that Adobe Marketo piece into the mix. Salesforce has gotten very large. I mean, being able to be innovative within their own organization and then having it actually move the needle for, say, shareholder value or that perspective is pretty difficult. So even Twilio's CEO, spoke about the fact that, look, we're going to keep it a separate entity, SendGrid a separate entity. We're not going to do any like expense cost sharing. We're going to focus on, really just, having additional top line growth. And so there is a business discussion on that front. And I think a lot of marketers should realize that maybe not everything is going to get integrated all the time, and not to read the tea leaves at a very superficial level. So and the reason it's important is to really understand, adding to Andy's point, that you can API your way into anything in terms of integration, but keep in mind that these entities are still very separate in many instances, and to keep that into consideration as you build your stack or consider what your goals are going to be. The fundamental questions of why are you using this and what are your goals and how do you work your way to meet those goals is still extremely important. So no matter how much quote unquote consolidation we're going to see in the MarTech space, it's still going to kind of create new opportunities for new firms to do something different. So I don't see that to change anytime soon, really. All these companies are reinventing themselves, and there are opportunities for new, companies to form to, meet some of the gaps based on all the moving parts.
But David,
I think I like Andy's point actually about the difference between integrating your data and integrating your decision rule, your decision layer. We've always made the distinction between a data layer and a decision layer. And this is all happening up on the decision layer, pushing internal onto the delivery layer, which is, SendGrid is a delivery engine. It really, I don't think it has any kind of real decisioning capabilities built in. It's something you hook up your marketing automation system or your campaign management system to when you want to push out emails, and you can hook up your Twilio, contact management system to it as well. So it's something that doesn't interact too much. Again, if you think about the core CDP as just building the data, right? The next layer up on that, which some CDPs do and some don't, is that whole let's integrate the rules process, which is very important and is much more of a challenge on some levels than just integrating the data. Although arguably that's because we've kind of figured out how to integrate the data. And 5 years ago, integrating the data was really tough. Now we have enough systems that have kind of thought about that it's not a solved problem, but it's a sort of an understood problem. And the next frontier is, how do I really integrate the rules? It's easy to say, oh, I'm going to have a single rule engine that's going to drive all my channels. But converting that to reality, particularly on the content side, again, to the point that Andy made about, it's one thing to have even integrated rules, but how do I have the same piece of content that serves as an email and as a call center script and as a website message? Those are fundamentally different. We've seen solutions over the years, people who try to sort of cram them all in. It's non-trivial. And I don't think it's quite been worked out perfectly, but it certainly is a frontier that people will be pushing against for quite some time, and it'll be a fun project.
Over the last 10 years, all the sort of value, all the hot companies and vendors were basically execution vehicles that operated independent of each other. And so I think that's sort of the sort of landscape shift that we've got going on is, that the value is going to come back to, now that we've got all this data, and we can, execute in 10 milliseconds in any channel, et cetera, how do you do it and do it intelligently? And that, it's an interesting conversation. I mean, we've been working with this sort of metaphor for 20 years now. That's sort of a, customer journey management, lay out your sort of flow chart of communication steps, which, is, still has a lot of application, but it can collapse under its own weight from a complexity standpoint. And, I think the interesting thing is how do the sort of, AI and machine learning approaches and that sort of customer journey management thing come together, because you really need both in order to sort of really operate in an omnichannel world. I mean, nobody can write customer journeys for, a big company, that covers every possible scenario. It's just, it's impossible.
Right.
Yeah. So there's basically what I'm hearing from all of you is there's the data piece, there's the decisioning piece, there's execution happening, and the pipes that keep moving things around between them, and then of course there's the integration piece, and all of that wrapped around in sort of prioritizing how you want to orchestrate, what bits of that journey you want to orchestrate, what's most important to you right now.
Yeah. And content management / content personalization is the other big sort of block of stuff that you have to have in the dialogue. I mean, the reality is, because even with all the automation we have, the expense of creating, content, or maybe said a better way, our ability to sort of decision and execute is radically outpaced our ability to develop content. So you can have a omni-channel, one-to-one, campaign that's everything you want it to be, but if you have to build, manually build a different piece of content for every customer and every execution, every channel, it'll cost too much. You won't do it. So I think that's another area where there's going to be a lot of development coming here, these, next generation, dynamic content sort of assembly capabilities that, again, are going to have to use, advanced analytics, not just sort of heuristic business rules, to sort of build and generate a piece of content that then can be sort of purpose delivered out into those execution channels in the right form factor.
And I really think we simply haven't talked enough about the content side of things. I mean, not that we don't talk about content and content tools and sort of the MarTech landscape view of things, but really actual content creation has almost been separate from the rest of MarTech. It's been sort of sitting over in a corner. Yeah, we have our little email builders and saying what you have is all the channel tools will usually have some sort of a pretty lame content builder built in. So I have my little email builder built into all my marketing automation systems, and my web CMS might have a little web page builder. But anything serious, you go out and you do it. You throw it over to your agency, and they probably do it in an Adobe product, right?
Yep.
And that was the thing that was actually most intriguing today. It's on your list for this week, but the number of announcements out of the Adobe Max conference about Adobe tightening up the relationship between its creative tools, and this is, what Adobe owns is that whole creative shop, and their marketing cloud, which they hadn't really done. I mean, it was always obvious that when they bought into and built up their marketing stack, sooner or later they had to connect that to the creative side of the house, and that was sort of where the gold was. And finally, they seem to really be doing it. And I think if we really connect those two, then content creation will not be sort of an afterthought that just gets sort of tacked on to you. Oh, I put it into my campaign system so somebody can write an email, but really something that becomes much more integral, much more AI driven, all the things that Andy was just talking about, dynamic content, but really well built dynamic content that where the actual capabilities of the content creation tool become integral to my campaign planning. It's not, I'm going to build a campaign, I'm going to throw a piece of content into it. The content will really be part of the campaign planning from the start, which has always been sort of the vision. I remember talking about this years ago, but now we're actually kind of getting there, and it's very exciting. It's a big change. I think a bigger change than people even realize.
And creative has been such a bottleneck, right? Like just the creation of content and then being able to do it well. And then, of course, now that we have more options and possibilities and journeys to hand out, but then we have this sort of endpoint where, okay, wait, now we got to wait for all the creative, we got to build that out. Actually, a lot of companies who are startups who come up with this great idea, they forget, oh, wait, I got to fill this entire pipe with or these different branches that I've just created with actual content. Who's doing that? And so if that sort of that bottleneck gets opened up and becomes unleashed, that's going to be a very interesting change and dynamic of marketers and even people in marketing operations to be able to say, hey, you know what? There's going to be an interesting collaboration, a new but interesting collaboration between scaling creativity to reach audiences and being able to get closer to having those personalized conversations that we've always aspired to have.
Yeah. No, I think there's something to be said for serendipity, even in this age of data and knowing, the machines telling you what to do and everything. But David, I think David, Andy, I think a great point coming out of that discussion previously is somewhere between, having all of the data and then jumping straight to, okay, we're going to use all these insights to do these amazing personalized experiences. We forget someone's going to create the content in the middle there that's, not just meaningful, but can be personalized, can be contextualized by the machines, et cetera, and, be dynamic. And we should be tracking that space more. So that definitely gives me an idea of who else we should be bringing onto this show in the coming weeks. And certainly people who can talk to us more about that layer in the middle. Great. So that was a great discussion. I think tons of interesting takeaways for our listeners and for me personally as well. Thank you, Andy, for joining us today.
Oh, thank you. It was fun. Anytime. Be happy to do it again.
Fantastic. And thanks, David and Anand and Amit. Bye.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining us. See you next week with our take on the big news in the MarTech world. Log into martechadvisor.com for more expert commentary on all things MarTech.